So we already learned a lot about, you could say, drivers. There'll be a little bit of repetition of what we already heard this morning. But now the point is that we move from the big global ocean to our own little small ocean. We can call it the Baltic Sea. This is the Baltic Sea. It's not a painting, as you might think of it. This is actually a cyanobacteria bloom that we have in the Baltic Sea that's in the background here. And this is actually one of the most pronounced and visible effects of eutrophication that we have in the Baltic Sea. This is really affecting people, and this is one thing that is actually, you can say that most people that find annoying about the Baltic Sea, that is when you have these massive algal blooms. But otherwise, I think that if we look around in this audience or in this room here, I think most of us have a connection to the Baltic Sea. And this is probably how we think of the Baltic Sea, how we enjoy the Baltic Sea. Going out typically in summer when the weather's nice, going to the beach, enjoying nice weather, going out for a little bit swim. And this is how it looks for most people when they just stick their head into the water, looking down. It looks healthy. It's a healthy sea that we have at these depths. But when we move out and go to deeper depths, we see the first signs that something is wrong. Things are not the way that they're supposed to be. This is the first sign that actually that we're encountering low oxygen conditions. It's coming up. So we see benthic animals moving out of their burrows, typically getting to the surface, sticking their siphons up into the water column as high as they possibly can in order to grasp just a little bit of oxygen that might still be there in the remaining water. This is not the end of it. We can move further out. If we do so, this is what we see. Here, there's no life except but bacteria. And in this case, we have these white sulfate-reducing bacteria, Bioturbating, that are covering the seafloor. So we only have bacterial life out there. So something is wrong. But it hasn't always been like that. If we look at how things have changed over the last 100 years, and I think this is one thing that I'd just like to point out. I think what's good about working with the Baltic Sea is that we're blessed with these long-term time series that have actually allowed us to reconstruct a lot of the history of the Baltic Sea over more than 100 years now. If we investigate data back from the early 1900s, we could see that hypoxia was essentially just confined to very few deep holes and covering only a few thousand kilometers. So you couldn't say that the Baltic Sea hasn't had, you could say, problems with hypoxia, but it was really restricted to like small areas in the past. And if we compare it to a more recent estimate, we can see that it's more than 60,000 square kilometers. And we also see in black here, so the red one, I should just say that that's less than 2 milligrams per liter, and the black one, that's where we have anoxic bottoms. In this case, it's more than 60,000. Danny mentioned that earlier. It's right now about 1.5 times the size of Denmark that's completely dead in the Baltic Sea. And if we look at it as a time series, this is an update with most recent data that we have. We can see that around 100 years ago, it was just like a few thousand square kilometers that was covered. And it really took off after the Second World War in the 50s and the 60s. Most of it related to, you could say, using fertilizers. The Industrial Revolution, where suddenly we could start, fertilizing our fields, and that led to severe effects of eutrophication. I'll come back to that a bit later. One more pronounced effect of the Baltic Sea that I'll just like to point out is this stagnation period. This is a period where actually, you could say, hypoxia seemed to improve, or the area was reduced, and the Baltic Sea seemed to improve. But as you can also see, this was not like a permanent state. It sort of, it soon returned to, you could say, what we've seen in the previous, actually to higher levels or more widespread hypoxia in the recent 2 decades than we've seen previously. Let me just roll back just to point out that we're actually in the Baltic Sea, in this part, we're talking about 2 basins. There's the small Bornholm basin here that's just located east of Bornholm that has perennial hypoxia. And then we have the big Gotland basin here, which has also perennial hypoxia. And I'll show some figures in the coming slide that will illustrate some of the time trends that we have for these 2 basins separately. But it's not only the central Baltic that has problems with hypoxia. We also have problems with hypoxia in the western Baltic. But there, it's not perennial, it's seasonal. And this is just something from our most recent survey of hypoxia in the Western Baltic from last summer. As most of you that live here in Scandinavia probably realized, we had a fantastic summer last year. It was really warm, and hypoxia developed quite early this year, or last year, 2018. And already in July, we were having a couple of thousand square kilometers covered with hypoxia in the Western Baltic. Fortunately, you could say, we got some winds that really mixed up the water, so it didn't turn out that bad as it might have done otherwise. So it was, you could say, the last, safe line for the Western Baltic, that we had some really strong wind events in the mid of August that really shook up, you could say, the whole system. So that was good for the Western Baltic. So we have, you could say, the Central Baltic, and we have the Western Baltic, but we also have a lot of coastal areas surrounding the periphery of the Baltic Sea. Oops, sorry, I just forgot to mention this one. As you can, let me just roll back. As you can see, we also have time series of how this has developed over time. Normally, it's around 1,000 to 2,000 square kilometers covered by hypoxia less than 2 milligrams per liter. But in some years, and this is the worst year that we've seen ever, that's the 2002 event, we had in mid-September, on average, 4,000 square kilometers, but it reached a maximum of 6,000 square kilometers covered with hypoxia. So let me just get to the coastal hypoxia. So we also have a lot of coastal systems around the Baltic Sea where we have very low oxygen conditions. And this is work that I did together with Daniel back in 2011. And we collected, you could say, all the monitoring data from around the coastal rim of the Baltic Sea and looked into which sites have actually experienced low oxygen conditions. And just looking at all the data from 1955 to 2009, we could see that there were a lot of areas that have, or coastal areas, that had been exposed to low oxygen conditions, particularly in the archipelagos here, both in Finland and also in the Stockholm archipelago, but also down here in just south of Stockholm, and also in the Danish Straits. There are a lot of coastal areas that have low oxygen conditions. What makes it a little bit complicated with coastal zone is that the mechanisms are not uniform. They vary a lot from one coastal area to another one. And they can express themselves as being episodic, seasonal, or perennial. And for that reason, I will not dig so much into the coast because it's going to be really a complex mix of all kinds of mechanisms. So I will focus instead on the Central Baltic and the Western Baltic and try to dig into what are the mechanisms actually controlling hypoxia in those two areas. So why is hypoxia such a big problem in the Baltic Sea? Well, essentially, hypoxia is occurring when, you could say, oxygen consumption outpaces the oxygen supply. So basically, it's a balance between those two processes. So let's look a bit into what are then the mechanisms governing the supply of oxygen to the bottom waters. First of all, the Baltic Sea is naturally prone to hypoxia, mostly because it's an isolated sea. It's separated from the open ocean through the Danish Straits here. It receives 16,000 cubic kilometers per second, or if we turn it into an annual scale, about 500 cubic kilometers every year of water, fresh water. And due to that there are a couple of sills down here that restrict the exchange, it has this very brackish character. And it also means that salt water is not constantly flowing into the Baltic Sea, but it's occurring as saltwater intrusion that happens during specific meteorological conditions. We can also look at it from another angle, looking at the transit, where we look going from the North Sea into the Baltic Sea, and we have the brackish water flowing out in the surface area, and then we have saline water penetrating in as a bottom current. And we can think of two types of water that's coming in. We have the less saline and less dense water coming in as an intermediate flow that fills the different basins, and then we have the dark blue, which is comprised of, you could say, what we call major Baltic inflows, which is denser water that comes in, and those are more rare, but they also fill out, you could say, the very deep holes of the Baltic Sea. We can look at an example of such an event, which happened, and I think it was already mentioned this morning. We had in December 2014, the last major Baltic, or really big major Baltic inflow, MBI. And this is just showing how the water from that intrusion of salt water slowly progresses, through the different basins from the sills towards the Arkona Basin to the Bornholm Basin, where we have perennial hypoxia, and into the eastern Gotland Basin. This is just shown as salinity. But you can imagine that it's a progression of this dense water that moves from one basin to the next basin, essentially. And in the beginning, it's bringing oxygenated water to the bottom. These events happen at irregular frequency and intensity. And I would just like to point out that we had this period here from the mid-70s until 1993, which we term the stagnation period, where there was essentially very limited major Baltic inflows, and that had repercussions for hypoxia in the Baltic Sea. So if we compare the 2015 event to what we'd seen in the past, we can look at more recent data. So in 2011, we had, you could say, a peak in terms of the aerial coverage of hypoxia in the Baltic Sea, around 71,000, an estimate, square kilometers. And we could see that in 2015, right after that intrusion, we were down to like 5,000 square kilometers. So it really had made an impact, you could say this. It really ventilated the bottom waters and improved the situation. It didn't remove all the hypoxia, but still it was better than previous years. But with these saltwater intrusions, there's also another thing that's coming into play, and that is that it's increasing the stratification. It's bringing more saline water in. This is shown here for the Bornholm Basin, where we can see salinity in the surface water, and we can see salinity in the bottom water. And you can see, especially, you can say in recent years, you really have much more saline water coming in. This will increase the stratification. Not so bad in the Bornholm Basin, but more pronounced in the Gotland Basin, where we can see that we actually in the bottom water now have salinities that we haven't seen for the last 50 years. So it really has become saline over the last, you could say, over the last decade or so, or even the last few years. And of course, this means that you would have a larger salinity difference between surface and bottom, because all of that saline water has not really made it to the surface yet. So there is a lag time there between, you could say, the saline water penetrating into the bottom before it makes it up to the surface and somehow equalizes, you could say, the salinity difference. So we can express this as by calculating the so-called Bruun-Weisler frequency, which is a measure of how stratified is the water column, how much energy is required to actually mix up, you could say, the water column across the halocline in this case. And it shows that that here, that this one, there's an increased mixing across the halocline with lower values. And we can see that in the Bornholm Basin, it appears to be more or less constant over time. It's a bit more dynamic basin. But the Gotland Basin has a lot more retention, has a long residence time. And we can see that at present, we have a fairly high Bruun-Weisler frequency, which means it's seeming, or it has a relatively high level of stratification. We can also see what's pronounced is that we have this period here, which is the so-called stagnation period, where there weren't any major inflows, and that actually reduced the Bruun-Weisler frequency, allowing more mixing to take place. This also had an effect on the location of the halocline, because with less stratification, and less, you could say, difference in the salinity, it was easier for, you could say, all these physical processes that take place, both, you could say, wind mixing, but also the mixing across the halocline you could say, the halocline moving up and down. And that was eroding the halocline, so it was actually located at deeper depths at the end of the stagnation period. So you can see that it actually decreased from around 70 meters down to almost, well, 80, 85 meters around the end of the stagnation period. But then after the inflow started picking up again, the halocline has moved up and is now located at the, you could say, more common 70 meters, which is, you could say, what it has been doing for most of the 100 years where we have time series. So what has happened then after that? You could say, if we focus on the major inflow we had in December 2014, we could see that the highest, you could say, coverage of hypoxia so far was in 2011. We had 71,000 square kilometers. But if we look at the most recent data, we can see that well, hypoxia has built up again, and it's reaching almost the same extent as we've seen in 2011. So we're back to the normal. So you can argue that these major Baltic inflow, it does give a relief to the Baltic Sea, but it's only a short-term relief because it has the negative effect of actually enhancing stratification, which means that over time, it will actually, you could say, strengthen the hypoxia in the area. We already discussed this morning. There's the whole effect about solubility, oxygen solubility in water. What I plotted up here is the oxygen solubility concentration for different ranges of temperature and salinity, which is displaying the typical range of salinity and temperature in the water that penetrates into, as bottom water, into the Baltic Sea. It has a big range here. You can see the temperature. It can mean whether it's coming in summer or winter, and it has different salinities. But the point is that this surface water that's coming in has also warmed up over the last more than 100 years. So if we take from 1900 up to the most recent data that we have, we can see that temperature has increased in the surface water about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Translating that into oxygen concentration, this means that there will be less, about 0.3 to 0.4 less milligrams per liter oxygen penetrating into, in the water that's penetrating into the Baltic Sea. That may not sound as a lot if you think of, you could say, saturation concentration being around typically 10. But it really has an impact when we know that that oxygen is slowly being depleted. So that 0.3, 0.4 could actually mean a lot for the animals that live down there. So what are then the mechanisms governing the oxygen consumption? Well, we've been through that this morning. We know that one prime suspect is the eutrophication. So it's respiration of organic material that's sedimenting from the surface. I think Beshi expressed it quite nicely. You know, everything is governed by, you know, what's happening at the surface. It's the surface that dictates, you could say, a lot of the process also taking place at the bottom. We also know that the Baltic Sea is typically nitrogen limited in springtime, where a lot of production is taking place. And that leads to the sedimentation of organic carbon down to the bottom. And then we have this mechanism that the organic carbon or the organic matter that's sedimenting down there is taken out, or it's consumed, taking up oxygen. And that leads to release of phosphate that's bound to iron under oxygen condition, but it's released under anoxic conditions to the water column. And that feeds back in over time to the surface layer. And it means that actually it can sustain these nuisance cyanobacteria bloom that I showed in the first figure. That is a typical phenomenon seen in the Baltic Sea in the summer period. This has also been termed as the vicious cycle. So, and from the paper in 2007 by Emil Vatera and co-workers, they had this nice horrendogram. I'm not going to go through all the arrows here, but I can just make the short version of it, which is essentially that with hypoxia, you have an increase in the release of phosphate that can sustain further nitrogen fixation, which leads to more organic material that can further sustain hypoxia, leading to P release again. So it's sort of a vicious cycle, and we have to break that in order to recover from hypoxia and to recover or to mitigate eutrophication in the Baltic Sea. If we look at the nutrient enrichment, that has also increased over these more than 100 years, where we have models and data that can describe how they have changed. We can see that nitrogen inputs from land to the Baltic Sea have more than doubled from the early 1900s to it peaked in the 80s and 90s. But since then, things have happened. So there has been a lot of reductions in the Baltic Sea. These reductions are even more pronounced when we look at phosphorus input. That have also, because it's easier to target a lot of, you could say, the phosphorus sources. So those have also declined. And we're, in both cases, back to levels that were typically observed in the 60s, something like that. We can also look into how has this affected the total apparent oxygen utilization. So this is actually a measure of, you could say, the oxygen deficit that we have in the Baltic Sea. This is work from the paper I did together with Daniel in 2014, where we could calculate from the raw data what is the total apparent oxygen utilization in the Baltic Sea, in two basins, in the Bornholm Basin and the Gotland Basin. And if we account for the physical perturbation or the physical influence on the system, taking into account, for instance, that we had the stagnation period, and took that physical, you could say, effect out of the equation, we can see that we have had an increase in the oxygen deficit over time, but we can also see that in more recent years it has stagnated. So there is hope for that we actually managed to at least halt the degradation of the Baltic Sea. But there's another factor coming into play, and that has also been mentioned earlier. That is the temperature. And we discussed that earlier, that temperature enhances respiration. In the Baltic Sea, we're not substrate limited. I think there's plenty of organic material down there to be respired. So, but we can see that, again, temperature has risen, just like we saw it in the surface temperature, both in the Bornholm Basin, but also in the Gotland Basin. And here again, you can see this pronounced phenomenon of the stagnation period, where actually it got colder. That could also contribute to why oxygen conditions were not as bad during that period. But then in recent years, we can see an increase, a drastic increase by more than 2 degrees from, you could say, from when it reverted from the stagnation period until recently. So definitely there's an effect of temperature as well. If we go to seasonal hypoxia in the Baltic, in the Western Baltic, this is something that's happening seasonally. And again, we have the circulation here. We have the brackish water going out in the surface layer, and we have saline water coming in the bottom layer. This is happening more continuously as opposed to the central Baltic Sea. But again, we know that oxygen is supplied from the saline water that's coming in here as a surface layer from the Skagerrak. And that circulation normally has a seasonal signal or seasonal variation. So typically the supply of oxygen has, you could say, a minimum during late summer, early autumn, and before it picks up again, you know, with increased wind speeds, etc., during the winter period. This corresponds to the peak of the oxygen consumption with the highest temperatures at the same time. And depending on how these two processes balance out, you can have seasonal hypoxia developing either widespread or really it can be, you know, a year where it's not really a big problem. So, but it's really variable from year to year. This is showing just how it can develop. It typically, when we start looking at it from, you could say, 1st of July, and it typically peaks in mid-September. This is from a period when we had very good data, almost weekly, cruises going out. And we can also see that in 2002, it peaked just close to 6,000 square kilometers. Actually, we assessed that during that specific year, since the hypoxic water is moving around, we had a total of 9,000 square kilometers that was actually affected by low oxygen concentration. Another thing is that we normally have benthic cruises taking account or measuring how much benthic animals, you know, what's the biomass of those in different locations in springtime. So what we did was actually go after the oxygen depletion had occurred in October, after it ended, and we measured or sampled the same stations. And we assessed that for that specific event in 2002, we lost about 300,000 tons of biomass. That, you know, how much is that? So to put that into perspective, if you think of an average person maybe weighing like somewhere between 70 and 80 kilos, well, that corresponds to the population of Denmark that was actually eradicated during that event. So again, the Baltic Sea has been experiencing hypoxia over the past. It's not a new phenomenon. We know that also from paleoecology. This is work that Celine did together with Daniel, where they looked at the laminated sediments. So typically, if you have benthic animals bioturbating the sediments, that's an indication of good oxygen conditions. But if you have lamination of the sediments, it's an indication that you have poor oxygen conditions. And what we can see is that there are two periods in the past that come out. One is the Holocene thermal maximum, which happened 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. And then we have the more recent medieval climate anomaly, which was around, you know, from 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. That's one indication of that we had problems with hypoxia in the past. We also have other redox or proxies that we've used. This is work from Caroline Slump and her group. One is looking at the ratio between organic carbon and total phosphate in the sediment cores, because organic carbon is preserved and P is recycled under anoxic conditions. And what we can see is that there are periods here where that ratio is shifted towards high ratios, indicating that we had poor oxygen conditions. We can look to another redox proxy, which is the molybdenum-aluminum switch, or sulfide switch, looking at the ratio between molybdenum and aluminum. And molybdenum is an indicator of hydrogen sulfide near the sediment-water interface. And again, what we can see is that the two periods come out as having, you could say, problems with hypoxia. But what's interesting is actually to look at the rate of change. How fast is this happening? And what we can see, and what is a little bit, you could say, worrying, is that the modern event that we have, the more recent data show that this is happening much faster than it has done ever before, about 5 times faster than any other of the rates studied in the core from the past. So, but the data also show, the cores also show that the system has recovered from, you could say, hypoxic conditions. And those periods of recovery are associated with lower temperature and less stratification. So that's a way of stratifying or breaking the vicious cycle. So, what will happen in the future? We already discussed that, you could say, earlier this morning. We know that the outlook for the future may not be too promising. We know that temperature is increasing. We cannot, of course, we don't have any measurements, so we have to use models to predict what's happening in the future. This was done by Marcus Meyer, and later on it was summarized by Daniel Conley in this paper in Nature. And so the red line is actually showing how it's happening or what has been the trend so far up to here in 2010 or something like that. But then we have 3 different scenarios. One is, you could say, business as usual. That is this one that is nutrient input increases. That's actually using the same agricultural practices that we have in the western part of the Baltic Sea, and you say using that in the rest of the catchment of the Baltic Sea, the eastern part of the Baltic Sea. It is maintaining the nutrient inputs as they are at present, and then if we implement the Baltic Sea Action Plan. So you can see if we just maintain nutrient inputs at the same level, hypoxia will still increase up to about covering 80,000 square kilometers. But if we reduce nutrient inputs, models predict that we will not get rid of hypoxia, but at least we will reduce the areal extent of hypoxia. We also looked a little bit onto the western Baltic Sea. How would this area actually be affected by temperature increases? And we looked into, by also using models, what would a 4-degree temperature increase, how would that affect the hypoxic area? And we took 2 years, one which had a very low cover of hypoxia, and one which was the worst year ever with hypoxia in the Western Baltic, 2002. What we can see is that in both cases, the areal extent of hypoxia would more or less double with a 4-degree temperature increase. So it's not too promising. We actually did just a couple of years later because, of course, having reduced nutrient inputs to this part of the Baltic Sea a lot, reducing nitrogen inputs by 50% and phosphorus input by almost 90%. A lot of managers were frustrated about, you could say, well, we've done a lot. How come we're not seeing any improvements? So we did the calculation. Well, what if we hadn't done that? You could say, what if we hadn't reduced nutrient inputs to that part of the Baltic Sea? And again, that showed that if we hadn't done anything, the area extent of hypoxia would have been double than it is today. So you can say that temperature increases has more or less counteracted the reduction efforts that we've done in the Baltic Sea, at least in that part, in the western part of the Baltic Sea. So with that, I get to my conclusions. And that is that the Baltic Sea is a sensitive, small sea that we have, our own little backyard. And it has had, you could say, 2 periods with hypoxia in the past, in the geological past. But what we've seen more now in the modern hypoxia that we have in the Baltic Sea, it is driven by the large or the enhanced inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus from land. And it's also much more intense and much more widespread than we've seen in the geological past. The saltwater inflows, they can modulate. They haven't generated any particular trend in the Baltic Sea. They modulate the aerial extent of hypoxia, and it can give a short-term relief. But the flip side of that coin is that they also enhance stratification, meaning that over the long run, it will actually lead to worsening. So you can say that saltwater inflows are good if they were more frequent, but since they're not, we cannot rely on, you could say, major big Baltic inflows happening every third month. If it were so, it would be good, but we cannot rely on that. And the same applies to the seasonal hypoxia. It will become more frequent, and it will also expand, as I just showed, in a warmer climate, if we don't do anything to reduce nutrient inputs even further. So those are the outlooks. So with this, thank you for listening.